Hey guys, it's Nicole at The Pearl Review. How are you? Thanks for watching my channel. Today I am super excited to talk about The Master and Margarita, one of my favorite books. It's considered one of the greatest Russian novels of the 20th century. This book is incredibly complex and unique, so I'm just going to dive right in. The book is set in the same time and place in which it was written, namely Soviet Russia, 1930s. It's set in Moscow. It's during Stalin's rule. So basically, the devil comes to Moscow to hold a magic show, and then he has his yearly party. Along the way, he decapitates a leader of a literary agency, and also he takes the Master and Margarita along for the ride. He takes them to the underworld, and they travel through space and time. Along the way, we also stop and read about Pontius Pilate, Jesus Christ, and the crucifixion. This book can be enjoyed on two different levels. Superficially, it is incredibly imagistic. This book is full of images. There's a reason why there are so many adaptations and different ways it's been adapted. The characters are totally colorful. The devil's gang, his retinue or entourage as he likes to call them, is gleefully absurd. And the book is incredibly funny. There is so much havoc and chaos that the devil wreaks in his wake. And honestly, I really recommend you listen in tandem to reading the book, because you really capture the humor in it when listening to Julian Reintut's reading of the book, and the humor is part of the whole package. Now, on a more deeper philosophical level, this book is a protest novel, and it is it's a criticizing of the communist state, and it has some really deep things to say about art and life. The book has three components going on. You have basically a retelling or repurposing of the story of Faust. You have the criticizing of Soviet Russia and the story of Christ's crucifixion and Pontius Pilate's damnation of Christ and his grief and regret over that. So those are really disparate things. This book is on those two levels, not completely together. They are disjointed, and that lends the book part of its uniqueness. So why Faust meddled in and, mixed in with Soviet Russia? Faust was this character that was a scientist, magician, and he is so desperate to seek his true meaning in life of becoming all-knowing, becoming godlike in his knowledge, that he makes a pact with the devil. And the devil is, he explicitly tells the listeners at the beginning that he is part of the whole. He is an agent of evil that works good, meaning the devil is there, struggle is there for man to struggle and become better, which is really interesting to me. And that's exactly what's going on with Vohland, the devil in Master and Margarita. Vohland, in his magic seance, hocus pocus show that he gives, he actually doesn't do any tricks. He does not entertain the people. He lets his idiotic minions do that. And he explicitly tells the audience that he's there to observe them. So Vohland is this voice of protest and criticism in this book. And he says that, I see that your clothing has changed. I see that technology has changed. But I wonder if you inside have, this new idealistic Russian state, this Soviet state that thinks that it's found its way. And he says, no, you haven't. Basically, he appeals to the basest needs of this audience that becomes this mob. money starts raining from the sky, and all of these luxurious items get handed out to people, and they start clamoring and screaming, and they eventually walk out of the place naked, not knowing it's, you know, fool's gold, basically. And what Bulgakov is doing there is he's doing this extremely cynical portrayal of the Russian people, that, you know, they haven't become these actualized humans, because if you are constantly worrying about your next meal or where you're going to live, you are not going to be that pinnacle of society. This is not going to be the society on the hill. So that is really hammered also when he talks about the literary agency, which I mentioned. So the literary agency that is head by Berlioz, he's beheaded at the beginning, which I briefly mentioned at the beginning. So what I mean by literary agency is there was this weird thing going on in Soviet Russia where if you were a writer, you had to be patronized by the state. If you weren't, you were basically ostracized or put to death, or poor and starving. So basically you were employed by the state and you were indoctrinated, you were an indoctrinator yourself, or you really couldn't survive. And this was an incredibly personal thing for the author himself. He actually throws his own book, this very book that I'm talking about, in the fire at one point because he can't get it published, because he is silenced, because he's a failure. And that is true. Stalin actually protected Bulgakov from the worst that could have happened to him, namely death. However, he silenced him. He wound up, I think, being a manager of a theater. And this book was published posthumously. 20 years after his death, it was released in the 60s and it became this cult classic. But there were years upon years of his third wife editing this book. And so it has all these pieces that really do come together, but it isn't incredibly coherent. And part of it is because there was such a risk on his life if he was more scathing of the Russian state. But it's definitely in there. So Faust is this really interesting thing in terms of protest, but also just intricate literary reference. Page by page. I did not know. I did not know when reading this, but in researching it and reading articles, rereading it, listening to it again, there is so much in here. It's full of Easter eggs, if you will. So how the hell does this have to do with Jesus Christ and Pontius Pilate, right? So in the very act of crucifying Christ, there is real corruption in the state. Basically, Pontius Pilate does not want to execute this good man. He realizes this man is a healer. However, he endangers himself if he lets him free. And he learns after the fact, after Jesus' death, by one of his disciples, Matthew Levi, that Jesus said that cowardice is man's greatest sin. And this shakes Pontius Pilate to his core, because he knows that he did the wrong thing out of cowardice. And that is really the toxic element maybe of the government. This cowardice of not doing the right thing really leads to corruption. And this is mentioned multiple times in the story of Christ and Pontius Pilate, that Bulgakov is definitely using this to say this is a parallel to the Russian society, to Soviet Russia, that all of this fear is leading to decay and evil. There's so many scenes in this book where there's all these idiotic, fearful people that are truly acting in a cowardly way. I do reference below as well a great talk that I think a professor did about this book, who's Russian and really loves this book. He mentions another great thing that ties in with Pontius Pilate and with Faust and everything, is that there is this allegory of disappearance. People supernaturally disappear in this book, and that totally parallels the disappearances that were happening at the time. If you don't know much about Soviet-era Russia and Stalin's rule, millions of people were sent to gulags. Millions of people disappeared. It's one of the most amazing and tragic events of the last few centuries, honestly, and it's really not talked about enough. So this was a big thing that was part of everyday Russian life. It both satirizes it, but it also brings to light, how evil, Stalin's rule is. And there is a lot of interrogation in this. Christ is interrogated by Pontius Pilate. That is a big, long chapter. There are the investigations. Everyone who meets the devil, basically goes to the insane asylum, but before they often get interrogated, and sometimes it's obliquely referenced. Again, because that was one of the things that actually, I think, got edited out in some of the first publications of this book. I really hope that you don't think that I'm starting to sound like this guy. I just really love this book, and there's a lot of interesting stuff behind it. This book is sublimely entertaining, sublimely intelligent. It's both literature and comedy. I can't recommend it to you enough if you haven't read it. Go out and read this book now. I love it so much. Thank you for listening, guys. Take care. Bye.